I guess the best way for this to happen is for Graham to field the questions and then to decide who should respond to them.
Come on, the big one. Hi, everyone.
So perhaps if people have questions for us about the presentations we've just seen, please put them into the chat for the session, and we can pick them up from there.
Hello, I'm just going to go onto the main screen now so I can field some of the comments from the chat that's coming up, and of course invite people using the raise hand function if you want to come up onto one of the screens, and then the stage manager will put you up on screen. To the panelists, could I ask you just to mute yourselves if you're not speaking? That would be helpful to avoid any feedback. And of course, it may be, stage manager, that you'll need to swap Nick back on in place of me if necessary. That's absolutely fine. I don't like being on the big main screen myself. Okay, so there are a few questions that have come in on the chat. So firstly, from Elissa. In preparing students for a standardized test, how important do you believe it is to prepare students for the environmental realities of that kind of test? How often should the conditions of a standardized test be replicated in order to familiarize students to how it will be? Is preparing for those conditions even necessary at all? Tony, who would answer that?
Maybe something that Atta would like to address first, as kind of the focus of his talk.
Maybe I can say something about it, because I'm working on standardized testing.
Sure, go ahead, Danny. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's very important to help students or learners to get familiar with the test, including the format and the criteria, and also some sample test, and all those materials can help them to increase their familiarity with the test, and I think it's important. Yeah. But and
may I build
Taiwan,
on the go ahead, I'm sorry.
all right. And I don't know, part of the culture, I mean, test preparation culture in Taiwan or in Chinese-speaking country is that people are so, interested in taking lots of mock tests before the real test, and actually, it brings negative impact, because it's not really lead to a positive learning, but just test drilling, and so we try to discourage people to do that. So I think there's certain reasonable amount of test preparation in terms of increased learners' familiarity with the test is important, but it should be a control at a reasonable level. Yeah.
If I could just add something to that. I think very often when people are preparing for tests, they forget that test tasks are designed to reflect in some way real world language use. So I think it's important for teachers to remind students of the connections between what they're doing on the test and what they're going to be doing in the real world. So if the kinds of tasks on a test are well designed, they're going to reflect the kind of language use that students are going to engage in future outside of the test situation. And if teachers can draw attention to the connections between what happens on the test and what might happen after the test, for example, if you're writing an essay, is that something that's going to prepare you for being able to write essays when you get to university, or write reports when you start work in a particular job? If you can make those connections clearer, I think that would really help the learning orientation of the overall system.
Yeah, agree.
I just want to add for those of us who are interested in the theoretical aspects is take a look at Massic's words and Massic's work. This is 1982, and he already discussed the 3 types of test preparation. So in reality, the questions is really refers to the first type A type of preparation that help the learners to be in the best situation. And there's type B related with what Tony just mentioned. So only the type C type of preparations is really harm the students. This is where gaming takes place. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let's
I
move.
also to build on the same idea in terms of we need to consider what type of test prep practices we're involved in. Because I think the bad reputation for test preparation comes from the fact that we basically focus on teaching to the test rather than familiarizing students with the different item types and how students can work on a test. So I think it's always good for teachers to think about the type of activities they're involved in, whether they're appropriate or not, whether they're contributing to improvement in performance or not. And going back to the idea that Amy and Tony talked about, I think what we need to do, we need to make sure that we're developing a good test, a good assessment tool that would reflect authentic tasks. And by default, that would improve test prep practices basically because you don't see that tension between assessment and learning.
Okay, Graham.
Okay. Great. So let's move on to the next question then. Thanks. This is from Carmen in Slovenia. In Slovenia, they've tried to make national assessments more assessment for learning than just the school leaving exams. But of course, they work with young learners, and there are many more open issues in that than in assessing adults. So question, have you done any research in the field of learning-oriented assessment for younger learners?
Not specifically. I haven't done specific research with younger learners, but in many ways, learning-oriented assessment is at its strongest in the primary sector and with the very youngest learners, and training them to become self-directed, self-regulated learners is one of the primary aims of assessment for learning as a project. And it's certainly proved very successful with children from the very earliest years of schooling. So although I haven't done research in this area myself, I know it is one of the core elements of the whole project is to work with the very youngest learners and to encourage them from the beginning to take more control for their own learning.
Nick wants to say something.
Sorry, that's a bit clunky getting on stage. I just wanted to highlight the fact that I was involved very early on in the design of the Cambridge Young Learner English suite of tests, really, which go from pre-A1 upwards to about A2 level. And the very design of them was based on helping learners to engage with learning rather than to certificate passing or failing. So it was a test designed with a learning orientation, or test suite designed with a learning orientation built in from the start. So no learner can fail it reports in terms of a range of shields or stars, if you like, for each of the skills that are assessed in the test. And the test is very much grounded in tasks which children do or in their learning, rather than seeing them as completely separate tasks. So I think we've been looking at how we can then enhance the feedback, the timely feedback, or the granularity of feedback, which can be used by the learners themselves to very early on help them engage with their own learning, but also with teachers in perhaps providing more formative feedback and feed forward into learning. And of course, the granularity of the feedback depends on what the test itself, what the construct entails. And I think where we're seeing the possibility for change, innovation, is in digitalization, in computer delivered versions, which can modify the construct beyond what we can currently do with paper and pencil. And then because we can focus on new and different things, we can also find ways to report on it and highlight it in more engaging ways so that learners take notice of what the outcome is. You see the challenge, and I'd be interested, Jessica, to see how you might take Dr. GPT forward by evolving the construct of GPT, so it would likewise help learners at a younger age in this way. Thank you.
Yeah. Nick just mentioned that the Dr. GPT, we actually provide also personalized feedback to young learners. The test that we developed for young learners, we call GPT Kids. And we take into, and the feedbacks also, well received by learners and also their parents especially. And I think we deal with young learners, so we need to accept the fact that the young learners may not be able to understand the feedback that we give them, but we help parents and teachers, and then they, by means of them, they can, help the learners to engage themselves in the learning process and also test preparation process.
I have a quick comment, and to the person who asking questions, is for the test, large-scale testing, to think about when it's done with young learners, is to think about the idea of decoupling the accountability issues, not the accountability to learning, but the accountability in relation to test score use. So at that stage, focus on learning and less focus on the test score use. So the social piece is really important.
I would just add, as a practical support, that the European language portfolio and portfolio models developed for young learners can be really helpful in this area.
Great, thank you. We'll go to another question from Helen, who says, candidates who see a high stakes test as an end in itself, for example, to gain entry to higher education, may not engage with feedback. Therefore, is that a risk to LOA? Who wants to speak? Nick? Tony?
Yes. It's a risk, and it's part of people coming through cultures where assessment is king or queen, that they direct themselves entirely towards passing the assessments without worrying too much about what happens once the assessment has been passed. It's then a matter of, and it takes time and it takes a lot of effort to persuade them that actually it is worth thinking about what's going to happen when you do arrive in university and all you know how to do is to answer the test questions, because that's not what you're going to be asked to do when you get there, and you'll be left struggling if you haven't thought about what happens later. And actually, I think, as I discovered in my own research, looking very much at this issue for my PhD, that it is very important for people to, and they can work more effectively on the test if they do look beyond the test and look at what's going to happen when they arrive at university and what skills will they need at university. And that will help them both when they get there, but also actually in passing the test, because they have a much better understanding of why it is they're taking the test, which improves their motivation and actually helps them to tackle the test tasks more effectively than they would if they were just concentrating on this element of gaming and trying to make sure that they memorize an essay or work out how to answer multiple choice questions without knowing the correct response.
I just want to add to say is, I think in our field, we ask too much for a test. I think a large-scale testing actually functions better for providing information rather than providing feedback, the kind of feedback that we as a teachers can give. So I think we need to think about there's a different functions of testing and assessment in our learning, and some do better than others, and we need both in our teaching and assessment.
Atta, you wanted to say something? Atta?
Yes, I want to build on the same idea that Liang and Tony talked about. Yes, we need to consider accountability, but at the same time, we need to think about improvement in terms of the type of performance we're expecting from students. And I think earlier, Tony talked about having a different mindset. And it's not only from the part of the teacher, but also the other stakeholders. And that takes us to the concept of literacy. So assessment literacy, not only for teachers. We need to convince students, we need to convince parents and other stakeholders that whatever we're doing as part of assessment, either giving feedback or collecting data, it's used for the purpose of improving what we do in the classroom and outside the classroom. Without that perspective, it would be difficult actually to convince students and parents that we're getting something useful out of this experience.
I agree with what Lin just said, that we seems to have asked tester too much. But in our context, why GPT provides diagnostic feedback and to incorporate learning-oriented assessment in our test is that because GPT, Taiwan is a test-driven society, and people have already used GPT, and they depends on the GPT to encourage English learning. So we use GPT as a tool to remind them of the importance of learning, not just taking a test as an end product. And so this is the reason why we provide Dr. GPT. And so we use, that's the reason why in my presentation I call it, it's a paradigm shift. It's a moving learning, testing-oriented concept or practice to learning-oriented, remind stakeholders, different stakeholders, the importance of why is it important to have GPT to develop a local English test in Taiwan is to encourage learners to, learn better and to more effectively be a more effective learner. So this is what we believe and we think we should do.
Could I? Thanks, Jessica. I agree with that. I just pick up what Tony said in the beginning of his talk. I think I've always called it language learning oriented assessment. You put the language in a different part of the acronym, if you like, but it is really important, and I make this point in my presentation, in my publication. We are thinking about what we are trying to teach people in language learning, which is a communicative competence in being able to take part in social practices where language is used. And in aligning learning and assessment, we should not take our eye off the prize, which is the outcomes of communication and communication skills. And as we look to the future, and this is something this conference can reflect on, what do we understand by effective language learning and communication, and how can we foster that in ways that we integrate the learning moments and the assessment moments into these cycles of learning feedback and then feed forward into planning new and different, perhaps more personalized ways of engaging. I'm looking forward to the world of no more test dates and no more fixed question papers, ways in which learning and assessment are integrated together in processes which happen on the daily basis, where language learning is a social process in language learning friendly environments, focusing a bit more on the multilingualism rather than or plurilingualism, as we like to talk about these days, rather than named entities of, I'm doing a bit of French now, I'm doing a bit of German tomorrow, and then I'm doing my English in a different class. What we're trying to do is not that, I think, and that's not the reality of how all of us use languages. We have a repertoire of language abilities, and when we want to profile them, we want to bring out those abilities and make them evident to people who need to know about it, say for employment or education. But actually, we want to be able to do it in our lives when it comes to talking to people or communicating in some ways. And that, for me, is the prize of LOA, making sure we keep that, at the center of what we're concerned with. Thanks.
Well said.
Great, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time now, unfortunately, for this panel. Tony, I'll just ask you if you want to say a few last words at all as we close.
I just want to extend a big thank you to everyone for coming from really around the globe to join us for this panel, and thank you to the audience. I hope you've enjoyed as much as I have. And if you have more questions, we'll be around in the conference. Please buttonhole us or our avatars and have a chat. Thank you.
Definitely. I definitely agree with that. Thank you very much to our panel, literally from around the globe. And yeah, do get in touch with them if you want to.